This is Anne-Marie Leake, Vice President of Communications for ePayResources. Welcome to the Payment Space. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tracy Marshall, Senior Vice President of Technology and Support for ePayResources, and Fred Gibbons, Vice President and Deposit Operations Payment Systems Officer for Jefferson Bank in San Antonio, Texas. We are talking about the ISO 20022 message format migration for the Fedwire Funds Service, which is effective March 10, 2025. Welcome, Tracy and Fred.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Hello.
Pleasure to be here.
So I will kick off our conversation by asking you both, from your perspective and experience, what is your number one piece of advice for financial institutions facing this migration?
Well, I would say don't just focus on the wire system. In theory, the wire system is only the beginning of it, but there are other systems. You have departments, internal departments, external clients, vendors that may rely on wire transfers or the current Fedwire format. So you want to know what your downstream implications or impacts are going to be. That could be integrations, data extracts. You have certain processes and procedures, maybe special processes and procedures for customers. So you have your day-to-day and some of your special procedures and processes. You may have information in your agreements or services that you offer, as well as disclosures that need to be updated. So what I would say is start with the system, but then make a list of the things that are interdependent on that service or process, and make sure you have those bases covered, because those are going to be the areas where I would say those are the blind spots where you're going to see impacts that you may not have accounted for just because the format is updated. That would be where I would start, because once you review those lists, then you can determine what additional action items or other areas that need to be brought in and have certain ownership of updates and changes that need to occur in conjunction with the system conversion that's going to happen on March the 10th.
All that's good. One of the things we struggle with currently is just getting a properly formatted wire request to us. And that's with the system they've had in place forever. And they're used to the FAME format and different message tags. So it's going to be an education piece for some of the departments that use us for the internal wires, not just the customer wires, and getting used to creating those new message sets and looking at things like Tracy mentioned. Do we need to revamp our wire form? Are all our interfaces connected? Are things flowing the way we expect them to? Another thing is, how is this going to affect our BCP planning? So there's a lot of things that go into this, and that's the reason we made the decision to start this fairly early, because even though we signed our agreements with our vendor, one of the things I was worried about was, the resource issue. And we saw some of that during our certification phase where, the vendor's juggling multiple engagements. So we wanted to get out way ahead of the curve so we wouldn't be contending with a whole bunch of other banks, because fintechs have finite resources just like we have finite resources for projects internally.
What phase in the process are you now, Fred?
We certified with the Fed in October, so we are good to go.
Excellent.
So Fred, when you say it's certified, when you certified with the Fed in October, so you certified for your primary processing channel for wires, right? Because you guys outsource wire processing. But what about, for disaster recovery purposes? Have you also run testing in Fedline Advantage so that if you were to do wires through that process, that you are able to process in the new format? And have you identified any impacts or issues related to backup processing on Fedline Advantage that you would have to account for in a disaster?
So for us, our vendor that we use, they have, with the cloud strike and some other things that happened this year, we've had to fail over to their backup service in another part of the country. So flipping over to Fedline Advantage would be like the last recourse. But we have been working with Fedline Advantage because the code words are getting retired. So we've been trying to figure out how that's going to work. I haven't seen a lot of information from Fed, but we've been set up where we could do wires on Fedline Advantage if we had to, using the new importing of the wire templates.
Yeah, I would say that's been some of the questions that we've received is, we use Fedline Advantage, or we have outsourced our wire processing. We use a wire system. We don't use Fedline Advantage, and our vendor is already certified. So what do we need to do? what I've encouraged people to do is make sure that while their vendor's been certified, make sure they run through their business as usual testing of their system with the changes to make sure if there are any, potential impacts that they need to know about, and also run through their testing on Fedline Advantage, because that is their backup process. And so you need to account for both, in my opinion.
That's a good point about the vendor being certified. Our vendor was certified with Fed already. And since we don't run that on-prem, they host our service for that. We didn't have to certify with Fed. We chose to certify with Fed because I wanted to see actual traffic flowing. I mean, Fed's got a plethora of information out there, but it's one thing to read a bunch of information, another thing to actually have hands-on seeing how the messages flow. We had a team that was involved. Not all of my wire operators were involved in the day-to-day testing. My concern is this new format's really going to throw them for a loop. If all they've ever seen is the FAME format, and this is more of the ISO standard. So the look and the feel and even the tags are way different. So that's another reason we wanted to go in and get our hands dirty, so to speak, actually getting traffic and sending traffic.
Well, and you also have, with this change, you have other systems that are impacted by it. So, for example, if you're getting an export out of Fed, or you're possibly importing that into your treasury management system or your online banking system, you have BSA, AML systems that also use that format. So it's not just the Fed system or your service bureau system that you need to make sure work. It's other systems that are reliant on the legacy Fedwire format that they've been using for, 20 plus years. Those vendors' systems need to also be updated to accept an ISO 20022 extract. And to your point, the message sets are different. Some of the information may or may not come out of the ISO 20022 extract. Some systems may not take all of that data. Everybody has to be involved that has skin in the game, because otherwise on March 11th, let's just say the day after the roll, the systems or the departments or external clients potentially that are waiting on their file extracts, they're not going to get them, because they won't exist anymore. So I would say that's another example of just making sure you understand everyone who has a stake in that format, because they're all going to need to know of this change if they don't already, and figure out what's going to need to be changed. I mean, their vendors, the systems may already be updated or be readied, but you need to verify that. And if you have foreign currency processing that's relying on that format, treasury management clients that, you provide wired data on their statements that is being passed to your core from that format. There's just a lot of different areas where people could be impacted or processes could be impacted because the change has occurred, So I think really where people are going to struggle is the integrations, the interdependencies.
That's one of the things we really tried to focus on. Just, you think you have a good grasp of all the moving parts that make up a wire transfer platform or system, but you think about it, there's just so many points of failure. So unless you test all of those from, getting the core responses and pulling address and names from CIF, and how it's going to display differently in core and on statements, and how things are going to flow for whatever treasury platform you use, and how internal users, like if you got a trust or a wealth department or even accounting, we try to get all those folks in the loop just so they would know that things are coming and changes. And while we've tested and we've certified, you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it.
Right.
Because it's hard to replicate in testing a full day's worth of production, even if you do stress testing. So I'm pretty comfortable where we're at, but until that switch gets flipped, we really don't know if there's any kind of nuances we may have missed. I don't think there are, but hope for the best, plan for the worst kind of thing.
Great advice. Tracy, you mentioned one particular question that you've seen on the payments answer line. Are there any other trends on this topic that you're seeing?
For the most part, it's really more of what does this change have to do with us? And we kind of go down the discussion track of, okay, well, are you Are you a service bureau where you're using a vendor system to process wires? Are you using Fedline Advantage? Are you using your treasury management system for processing? Are you just using offline wires, which to Fred's point, the offline wire code process is going to change. So everybody's going to have to be using Fedline Advantage starting in January in order to process wires in some form or fashion. And so we really kind of talk about the channels that they use. And then from there, I just kind of give them my experience is, you're going to want to make sure that I like a three-legged stool approach. So your primary process, you need to make sure that you have all your bases covered as it relates to this change. But then when you take a look at it, okay, our backup process, what's different between the primary and the backup? Make sure you test those areas or that you have everything validated that it's going to work with this new ISO 20022 format. And then your third leg, which is your offline or your backup, like whether that's a buddy bank or correspondent relationship or offline wires that is, being sunsetted. You're going to want to make sure that you have everything covered and updating your procedures and your BCP plans and make sure you test it to make sure you make changes after March the 10th, because then you're going to have real life experience that you're going to reflect on. Okay, say this is what we thought it was going to be. Did that actually prove out? So we've had a handful of calls in the last year to see, about this change. But honestly, to Fred's point, I think a lot of folks are kind of in a wait and see mode, which I don't think is a good idea. I think you need to run a risk-based scenario on everything that you do on a day-to-day. Even if you don't know, you can highlight what are the pitfalls. Like, okay, this is what the process normally is. These are the outputs. What happens if any one of these things doesn't work properly? What is our backup plan? And then you kind of solutionize that, or at least kind of put together a risk-based scenario analysis so you kind of can account for what you don't know and just be prepared for it, because it's more of a proactive approach than a reactive approach. But the issue and the concern that organizations, especially financial institutions, need to have is reputation risk. So you have monetary risk here and you have compliance risk, which we've talked about, but you also have reputation risk. So if something doesn't get tested or implemented properly, then you have bad customer or member experience, and then that can translate into lost business potentially, or failure to acquire new customers because somebody says, oh, such and such organization doesn't have their act together. You really don't want to put yourself in that position. And so I would treat this, if you haven't already started, you're like, I don't know where to start. I would probably say, pretend like you're implementing this system for the first time. What are the things that you would do? And then back into what are your impacts. But knowing who your stakeholders are, internally and externally, that's the first step, because those folks are going to be the ones who can highlight for you what their impacts are, which then can back into what you've already tested or what you still need to test or ask about.
And those are all great points. One of the things I worry about, Tracy, is this has been knocked back so many times and delayed so many times. I sometimes get the feeling there's some kind of complacency out there that people think maybe this won't happen or we're still going to have time. And I worry about some of those institutions because just Fred, speaking as Fred, not as Fred from Jefferson Bank, I'd be hard-pressed to imagine Fed delaying this date at this point in time. So I just worry there's going to be some banks out there that get caught flat-footed, and we'll look for someone to rescue them, and there's not going to be any rescuing.
Well, no, because everybody's going to be knee-deep in fixing issues that are going to come about as it relates to the update anyway. So, you're going to have resource constraints. You're going to have on the vendor side, on the Fed side. In a perfect world, you hope that it's a smooth and seamless update and there aren't a lot of issues. They could happen on that day. They could happen the day after. They could happen the week after. You just don't know. And you have the updates that occur from a system perspective, but you also have the accounting updates. You have the reconciliation. What does that look like? People pulling their reports, running their daily balance checks, risk management processes that occur after the fact. There are all kinds of interdependencies that I don't think people think about. And I agree with you. I don't think that the Fed is going to push this. I mean, it's been kicked down the road a while, multiple times. And this is kind of I think in preparation, obviously with Fed now and, the ISO 20022 being the standard now going forward for many industries and solutions, rails, they have to get it done. I would agree with you. I think that people have it was on their radar, then it fell off because other fires are burning every day. And unfortunately, we're not that far off from this happening. So people are going to have to at least put it on their radar and run maybe even an expedited risk analysis to see what they think the potentials are and try to get in there and do as much prep as they can.
One of the things from my perspective, I don't want to say I'm old, but I do remember the migration from Fiddleline DOS to the Windows-based platforms. And so I've got some scars from that. So I knew this was going to be a big undertaking. And that's another reason we wanted to jump on this and get this done early. Also, we wanted to implement FedNow and RTP, and this was a stepping stone for us to be better prepared for that, because some of the testing we saw in the Fed certification for ISO 20022 is some of the same stuff I'm seeing with my certification for FedNow. So it was all part of a greater plan for us, where we wanted to position ourselves to be able to offer those services, be ready to hit the ground running when those dates came up.
ePayResources developed a communication plan around this migration to keep the urgency and all the preparation resources top of mind for our members. We kicked it off back in April with a quick poll on our homepage. The poll results at that time showed that 27% of respondent institutions had begun preparation, 19% had not begun preparation, and 53% were not sure. What should those responses look like now, and where should they start? Tracy, you've already touched on that, talking about starting with a risk analysis.
I would expect, 80% or more organizations that they're in some form of process. Hopefully they're closer to completing their testing and making final preparations with policy updates, processes, procedures, looking, at external customers or solutions that they've integrated and tested against. Hopefully they're prepared so that when they cut over, that if there are any impacts, that they're minimal at best. But what I would say is, if they have not yet already get started, do a risk analysis, identify the key areas, the stakeholders. There's also some really great information that the Fed has provided on their website. So it kind of gives you a place to start. They have some implementation checklists that cover different setups or configurations. So I would start there and then kind of drill into the available information based on, how organizations do business, the different areas that they need to focus on, and start somewhere. Don't not start because you're not sure. Somewhere, somehow even if they need to call, their Fed representative, or if they want to call in and speak to me directly, I can give them, kind of a place to start as well. But just sitting on it, to Fred's point, is just kind of being in the wait and see mode. That's just not acceptable. It's a bad decision.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the implementation center. There is a wealth of information out there. And Fred, I know you've been very complimentary about the support you all received from the Fed in the testing and certification process. Did you experience any gaps in what was available through the implementation center? Are there additional questions that folks should be asking that maybe you did not encounter in any of those resources?
From my perspective, I thought the experience with Fed was great. When I first started with my certification process with them, I read the material, and to me, it seemed pretty straightforward. But then when you get in there and you're doing that, and it's something new you're not used to processing, we had to come back and get the vendor to fix some stuff. And then we also had to come back and redo some testing. But I think we had 3 different sessions before we finally certified all the different things, because there's a lot of items to certify. Some of those are optional, some of those are mandatory. We tried to do all the optional ones just to get a better sense of it. But I found it to be not an easy thing. I think as we get more familiar with the formatting, and once we got in there, because it's one thing to read the material and sign into whatever test environment you have, but it's a different thing to actually push stuff out and receive stuff back. So it went well. It was not an easy process, just because it's an important process. You want to make sure you understand all the different nuances of it, and until you actually get in there and do it, rubber hits the road kind of thing.
Fred, did you do any external customer testing or third-party system integrated testing, like solutions that rely on the data that's coming out of your Fed system?
We did a lot of testing with our core. One of the things we're concerned about is how it's going to display for customers to see. That customers are used to seeing messages like the IBAN information, that sort of thing, getting pushed out to them, making sure they still have some kind of reliance on being able to get that sort of information. We also wanted to see stuff coming over from our treasury platform to make sure that things were talking to each other.
Yeah, so you were able to process wires, like receive wires from your treasury system, push those through, get them back with confirmation numbers, and then pass that information back to your customers through like online systems or statements. Did you run into any issues doing that, or was there anything that was kind of an aha moment?
One of the issues was, in pushing information back and forth through our core, we haven't had this set up before, so we had to make sure, IP addresses were whitelisted, and there's a lot of little drill down details because these are new channels. So we had some problems with that initially, but that's just some of the stuff you kind of expect to have happen. That's why we test, right?
Brings up a good point, because also bringing in your technology team on this project, because while most organizations might believe, okay, well, we've got these systems already set up, everything's going to flow the way that it normally flows. You have new IP addresses, you have new domains, you have subdomains, different ports potentially that may need to be opened up for testing or go live. There might be data processing impacts. So where they're needing to pull information from other sites that different than where they were pulling them from traditionally from the Fed, that would be another example of a stakeholder, typically not brought into the mix until there's a problem. So I would say that they need to definitely be on the list, and you may or may not need them in every facet of the project, but there is going to need to be a technical liaison for sure between the vendors, systems, and your data and your core.
Tracy, to your point, there's just so many different things to consider. We tried to make a checklist of replicating what we do in production on a daily basis, like down to stuff like, how's this going to affect our Dodd-Frank disclosures? How's this going to affect email notifications? How's this going to affect the way that other departments that have like a browser-based system to input wires versus the treasury platform versus getting stuff in from the banking center? So all those different inputs and making sure those things work the way we expected them to as well.
Did you have to do you have online banking wire forms that you guys customize in your system for the retail side, your wire forms that are coming in from your branch locations? Did you guys have to make significant changes to account for the ISO 20022? Were there different fields that were part of ISO 20022 that weren't part of Fedwire? So can you go into some detail around some of those things that you had to change?
We're trying to make the form as user-friendly as possible because, even now, if you're not in the day-to-day processing wires, you can make the form as what you think as clear as possible. But if you're not familiar with BICs and SWIFTs and IBANs and all that stuff, that's where we usually have problems with our existing forms. So we're trying to make that as user-friendly as we can. But we don't want to, they're not going to understand these new tags and stuff. So we're trying to make it where they fill the form out to give us all the information we need, but not having to reinvent the form and train them, if that makes sense. What
about your BSA AML team or your OFAC, the reviewing of that? Is there anything that was like offline or, through like day after exports, imports that you guys had to modify or process or test?
Now, we've got a separate fraud solution, and we've also got a separate OFAC solution, and we tested those as part of this process, but we didn't really see any kind of issues on that side, but, you want to test it to make sure. Now, on the fraud solution, the one we use, we didn't really have a test environment for them, so we were kind of having to use, like, live data. So those are some of the kind of things you want to make sure you're aware of as you're doing your testing, whether it's not just your wire system, like you mentioned earlier, it's all the other things that feed into it. Like we have a separate solution for the OFAC, we have a separate solution for fraud.
Yeah, you want to make sure, especially if you have to use live data, that you're disabling communications or emails or notifications because you don't want to freak people out while you're doing your testing. Like, what is this?
Yeah, the other thing is some of those products, I own the OFAC solution we use for filtering incoming and outgoing wires, but I don't own the fraud solution. Another area of the bank, BSA and fraud own that. So I don't have a replication of a test environment per se, but we had to make some kind of allowance for that.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you don't. Some vendor solutions don't come with a test environment. So unfortunately, you have to account for that as a potential risk. And that's an example of maybe just walking through a tabletop exercise as this is what our normal process is. This is the way the ISO 20022 is going to change that. What do we think is going to occur? Or even if you walk through it with the vendor, just making sure that they've accounted for it on the day of, because I think that's another potential situation is that, you have the Fedwire vendors who are prepared for this change because they've had to certify with the Fed. I think you have these downstream applications that are the BSA, AML, OFAC, and other risk management applications that they may have this on their radar, but they may not think that it's a big deal because their systems just read text files. Well, depending on the way that they're validating the data before they can actually read it, the validations actually may fail. So they may be able to upload the file and read the text, but it has to get through a validation tool first. So there are just different scenarios that you have to walk through and think, and just even call and verify. This is occurring. Are you aware of it? Have you guys taken a look at the changes, the new format, and are you compliant with it? Just an initial phone call to those vendors just to see. And if the answer is, I don't know, I'll have to get back to you, then that should immediately raise a red flag that you need to follow up and be like, okay, I need to talk to somebody about where you are in this, what work you've done, because I don't know is not good. And the next day after we process, these other areas or departments or people are going to be expecting to see details or data or reports on this information. So I can't work with I don't know at this point. I need to make sure. So that's another potential drawback of starting this late, is that you may have those interdependent systems that they're not ready. They may not be ready. So then you have to come up with contingency processing, or you have to escalate that up through your executive management and your senior leadership and operations, because they all need to know, here's what we're going to be dealing with potentially. And then you have to account for alternate processes.
That's an excellent point, and a scary one too. We've touched on so much in this discussion: testing, inputs, fraud, forms, business continuity, interdependencies. Is there anything we have not touched on, or do you have any final parting words for our members wherever they fall in this process?
One of the things we're going to do is, come that day, that's looming on the horizon. I mean, we're planning on being here early just to make sure things are flowing the right way. I've got staffing arranged so that if we have to be here late for balancing issues or for whatever reasons, and then we're going to have communication if there are already issues, and just to confirm that everything's, at start day is fine, end of day is fine, we're balanced, that kind of thing, just kind of a checklist for day one. Because like I mentioned earlier, we're certified and we tested and we feel good, but we still don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, and I would say you want to actually probably have a week one checklist, because there's the post-processing impacts that you maybe haven't been able to test. So you're going to want to check those off your list to see if there are any impacts or tweaks that you need to make. But on top of that, Fred, you mentioned communication. I would also review and see whether you need to have any kind of external communications to customers to let them know that this change is occurring. If there are any potential impacts or information that they need to know, you're going to want to communicate that sooner rather than later. And then I would also, Anne-Marie, to the point we talked about the implementation center that the Fed has on their website.
Yes.
If folks haven't started yet, I would say go to that site and at least start with the checklists. Make sure, depending on your processing structure, that you are aware of the different scenarios and what information is relevant. There's some readiness and timeline details. Make sure that you've reviewed those to ensure that you know what you need to be working on between now and the go live. And then touching base with your vendors and your stakeholders, anyone who has skin in the game, if you will. Also, there's some great education out there that's already occurred, some on-demand webinars that you can watch the recordings of to get a feel for what you need to know. I think there's some Q&A that was in there during the live sessions that people can take advantage of. And there's some other additional relevant information on that page. I know that the Fed's constantly updating that page as new information comes available. So I would say probably making sure that you're checking back weekly to see if there's anything new that you haven't seen yet or you haven't reviewed, just to see if basically just connecting all the dots, making sure that you are as prepared as you possibly can be, and then reaching out to your vendors just to make sure they're ready. Are there any things that they need you to be aware of that you need to be prepared when you go live, like how to submit tickets? Who do you need to coordinate through? How do you escalate issues? What kind of information are they going to need when you report a ticket or an issue? Just knowing what that entails And then for the call tree that Fred had mentioned, is the call tree isn't just your operations people. Every organization's contacts and, whoever the departments are that have a stake in the wire process, somebody should be assigned on the call tree for that area to answer questions or be a point person if there are issues or questions that occur that can be escalated up through the leadership or the project management for the organization, for the financial institution. That way you don't have everyone just emailing everyone randomly, and you're not able to kind of get your arms around what's an issue, what's a question, what's something that you have to address now, what's something that goes on a list that can be reviewed later, what needs to be put into a pipeline for future updates. Just trying to put a process around post implementation as well.
Very good point.
Yeah.
The other thing I worry about is for the banks to get caught flat-footed. If they think they're going to reach out on that conversion day and get a hold of somebody in customer support right away that's going to fix their issue, be prepared to be in queue for a while. I think that's going to be a crazy day as far as banks needing support from their vendors and that sort of thing. I'm hoping it's not, but it's another thing to be aware of, I think.
It would wind up being like the Y2K we imagined but didn't really happen.
Or same day ACH. We thought, when same day ACH rolled out, there was going to be a big onslaught of issues, and it really wasn't. I would just say hope for the best, plan for the worst, and just be prepared to support through whatever comes your way, but just know who's available to you and who you need to work with and in what order. Because if you don't plan, then you're going to be in a bad place on that day with those issues if you don't have a plan in place. It's not going to be fun if there's not a plan in place, for sure.
Thank you both so much for your time today and this very thorough discussion. I really appreciate your diligence in making sure that our member institutions understand all the implications, especially the ones they may not have thought of, and they're fully prepared well ahead of this migration. And of course, that time period is closing in on us. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Anne Marie. It was a pleasure.